I've known Dave since he was a graduate student, because I think the first time we met, he had started the energy club at MIT, and I was a panelist in one of the MIT energy meetings way, way back. And of course, I've followed his career. And then, you know, I have two of my favorite people sitting in the front row, so I've also known Joel Moxley for a long time. So it's great to be here. You've already got a bit of a background about what I'm doing, working with the U.S.-China Green Fund. Just going to say I've had a Stanford connection for quite a while as well. So definitely love Stanford and take almost every opportunity I get to have a chance to meet with Stanford students. When I was chief scientist at Cargill, I sort of was getting inquiries from a bunch of universities of whether I wanted to be an adjunct professor someplace. And I literally proactively sat down one day and said, okay, all these places are asking me if I want to be an adjunct professor. If I got to pick where I would be one, where would it be? It would be Stanford. So I wrote an email to a couple of people I knew at Stanford, and they immediately came back and says, yes, sure, you can be an adjunct professor. So I accepted the opportunity, actually committed to spend 2 weeks a year here without bothering to ask Cargill, because I figured I wanted to do it so badly that if Cargill said no, I would just take vacation, and it would be a vacation. Fortunately, Cargill said yes, and I ended up spending a week in the spring and the week in the fall here for about 5 years, and then continued it on for a while. Lately it sort of has wound down and I haven't been doing it, but it was fun. Just one other story about that time. I know that I'm going to have dinner with a few of you guys. The first time I ever came, I was chemical engineering, and I said, you know, it'd be fun to get to meet some of the undergrads. So I called up the secretary and said, why don't you just check around and see if any undergrads are open to going out to dinner with, you know, an industry guy and just getting to meet one another. And so she said, sure, you know, I'll do it. About 2 hours later, came back and I had 45 students. That, okay, this was a little more than I had expected. It was a little unmanageable. You know, I had to like rent out a big room in a restaurant, and it wasn't quite as of an interaction as I had hoped for. But I learned to be a little bit more discreet later on. You've already heard that I started First Green Partners. I love literature and poetry and stuff, so I normally don't tell people this, but First Green Partners sounds like a boring name, but it comes from one of my favorite poems by Robert Frost that starts, nature's first green is gold. And it's actually a very enigmatic, interesting poem. I said, venture capitalists, you know, first green is gold. That's a pretty cool. In fact, when I thought of it, I could like barely wait to get the URL set up. And nobody else kind of knew why we had such a name, First Green. Two of the companies that we funded are both here in the Bay Area. And one of them is Monolith Materials. I know you've talked to them. Two Stanford mechanical engineering students founded it. We'll be building a world-scale plant to crack methane to make hydrogen and carbon black, and the plant will be in Nebraska. The other company that's out here is more stealthy, and we don't really talk about it very much, but it's called Trellis Biotech, and it is using waste gases to make amino acids. And amino acids are primarily used in animal feed. In order to get the most efficient production of protein with animals, you typically have to supplement their feed with amino acids like lysine, methionine, threonine, and the like. And it's probably technically the most complicated thing I've ever worked on, but the business case is really great. So you learn in venture capital that you can either take technical risks or market risks. Ideally, you don't want to take both. And I tend to prefer to take technical risks because I believe in technology, I believe in folks like you. Market risks are much more challenging, much more difficult. And so this one is, the market risk is like the best case I've almost ever seen, but it comes with a pretty substantial technical risk. So Dave asked me to talk broadly about working with big companies and relationships with big companies, and it is pretty critical in certain types of companies and startups. So if you're going to develop a new app or sort of a more typical Silicon Valley type product, maybe you don't necessarily need to have some tight relationships with big companies, but if you're going to work on something that is a really complicated, older industry with lots of complicated history and interconnections, and with the requirement for extreme amounts of capital, perhaps, and complicated market access and market channels, it is very, very important to have some kind of connection to some bigger industries. In fact, typically companies in these sorts of fields are often started by former employees of some of these big companies. So it actually is a little bit more challenging for a group of grad students or undergrads to come up with a totally transformative idea in some of these. It just helps to have some of that industrial perspective to start. Not impossible, and actually I'm glad you guys are trying to do it. So I wanted to think about, first of all, what are the absolute musts that you must do when working with big companies? And then, what are sort of some of the other areas that are maybe a little bit more in the gray space? And then what are the sort of benefits and what are the risks? And then I'll try to give examples, but I decided not to prepare slides, and I don't want to just be talking the whole time. I'd like us to get to the point where we're asking questions and things. So first of all, what are the absolute musts? You're going out and you're trying to develop an ammonia process, or you're working in some other biofuel area or energy area. First of all, obviously, network, talk to as many people in that industry as you can possibly talk to, and use whatever connections you can to network with those people. And try to find out who the experts are fast. If you're a venture capitalist, one of the things that I spent a lot of time doing, and I thought I was pretty good at, and I bet you these two guys are good at, is finding, as venture capitalists, we have to do due diligence. And I sometimes would have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 days to diligence a new deal. And what I got to do is, within a day, figure out who are the industry icons in a field, who are the leading top people in a particular industry, and do it in 2 days for cement, in 2 days for ammonia, a day and a half for the coal industry, a day and a half for steel, a wide range of different topics. So if you're going to be in venture capital and in technology venture capital, you got to be able to do this fast. If you're starting a company, you got a little bit more time to figure it out. So we could talk about how do you find these people, and it's a bit of an art and a skill, but you absolutely should identify who are like the top 5 or 10 people in your industry and make sure you talk to them. So here's a story that I'm not going to tell now, but if we have time, I'll tell it. So if we have time, ask me the Kior story. the most bizarre industry expert story I've ever had, but I don't want to, I will tell it if we have time, but I want to make sure we stay on track. One of the things about this kind of talk is that it can easily kind of get waylaid into lots of stories, and I want to talk about a few key points first. The second thing is, before you talk to these people, so most of these experts, I don't think you have anything to worry about, but you do have to figure out how much you are willing to reveal about your idea and your technology. And if you don't tell them anything, they're not going to tell you anything. It's, this is like networking 101. You've got to tell people something in order for them to tell you something. So if you just cold call somebody and say, I'm working on wind power, and you're not willing to kind of go a few steps further, you're not going to really learn a lot. So you need to kind of know how far you can go in the networking story. And a lot of people in these companies are very wary of calls like that. So you have to kind of understand that. I would recommend that before you get too deep, you carefully think, how much can I reveal? How much am I willing to reveal? You want to reveal as much as you possibly can without damaging your IP or without giving away the farm, because you are potentially talking to competitors here. If you had already started a company, I would recommend that you probably make sure you have your provisional patents filed, and that's probably where you need to be. If you were at a big company, a big Fortune 500 company, there would probably be rules that you could not say a thing about anything you were doing until your patent had actually been issued. In your case, you don't have the luxury of that. You're going to have to reveal more information about what you're doing in order to learn and to get feedback. So, probably have filed a provisional or something at that point. Then, I think that what you want to do is, after you've started to talk to these people, you're going to want to figure out a way to get 1 or 2 or 3 of them signed on as advisors. And the most useful advisors are recently retired people out of the industry that you're in. I kind of call these are like red meat to the venture capital world. Right? If there is somebody who is an expert in one of these areas of interest, ammonia, coal, whatever, and you find out that they have recently retired, at least from my standpoint, I am trying to do everything I can to figure out how to create a relationship with them, be helpful with them, get them on the board of one of my companies, get them on the advisory board of one of my companies. I'm not going to try to hire them right away because they're not thinking about taking a new job yet. Eventually you might be able to hire them, but they are red meat. And so again, part of your networking is, how do you find these types of people who are going to retire soon or recently retire, because they have a wealth of knowledge. They are extremely valuable as advisors to you. They bring an enormous amount of credibility to the company when you're starting to do fundraising, and a lot of just help in terms of networking, in terms of industry policy, industry knowledge that you just will never be able to learn any other way. And then, they could be employees at some point, and they can be founders, in fact. If you find the right person, they could potentially even be a founder of one of your companies. And that's actually a pretty good combination of, really smart Stanford engineer or MBA teamed up with an industry icon. That is a fundable combination. Little aside, for early stage company, there are 4 things that I am interested in. 3 are absolutely critical, and then the 4th one is, I think, secondary. But the first one is the team. You know, it's a trite cliche, but if you got the right team together, the company is going to get funded, most likely. And some venture capitalists will fund companies without really even knowing what in the heck the company is doing, just because they have the right team. Absolutely. And the right team is Stanford person with industry icon. That's a fundable team. It's a team that you can coalesce or nucleate a company around. Second is a big idea. This has to be venture backable. This has to be an idea that isn't just a good idea, but it's potentially big enough to give venture returns to the investor. So this could be, if your company is going to be, $100 million, potentially worth $100 million or so, that may be extremely exciting to you. But, and I know you had Vinod Khosla talk here once. When I worked with Vinod, if he didn't think this was a $1 billion exit opportunity, he wasn't going to put 1 cent in the company for the most part. He would always talk about a $0 1B company. This is a company, it's a $0, but it's got the potential to be a 1B company. And every decision he would make from day one would be a decision that you would make assuming this company was worth $1 billion. Changes the way you make decisions about the company. So it's got to, and others have, $300 million threshold, but it's got to have it has to be potentially worth enough to make it worth the venture capital's effort. Now, not all companies have to be funded by venture capital. So that's the other thing, is you may have a great idea that was a wonderful company that's going to send all your kids to Stanford that is not venture backable. So don't get into the feeling that everything that is done, most companies that are started are not backed by venture capital. But you're in this venture capital bubble where if it's not venture capital, it doesn't seem like it's a real company. Just keep it in mind. You can make a lot of money and do really well without venture capital. Third is you have to have some sort of protection. In technology companies, that's typically IP, but it can be something else, unique market channels, unique contacts, trade secrets or something. So those are the big three. Those are the